Death has always been an uninvited guest at weddings, a shadow that lingers at the edges of joy. But in 1855, in a small windswept village just outside Bergen, Norway, death did not wait patiently at the threshold. It walked down the aisle. It stood in the chapel. It pressed itself into a single photograph that would haunt generations to come. Her name was Ingrid Aas, a 21-year-old bride-to-be, celebrated in the village for her beauty, her voice, and her quiet devotion to faith. On the morning of her wedding day, she was found lifeless in her room, her body still dressed in anticipation of the vows she would never speak. Grief-stricken but determined to preserve her final image, her family summoned the village photographer to take a portrait. What should have been a solemn memorial became instead one of history's most unsettling enigmas. When the plate was developed and held up to the light, those present swore their hearts froze in their chests. Ingrid's lips, cold, pale, and lifeless, seemed to curl upward into the faintest smile, a smile no corpse should have worn. Some dismissed it as a trick of exposure, the faint shifting of rigor mortis. But others, especially the villagers who had lived in the shadow of old folklore, whispered that this was something else entirely. They said a pact had been fulfilled, a debt repaid, a promise sealed beyond the grave. The photograph was quickly hidden away, sealed in a wooden chest by Ingrid's surviving relatives, who refused to let it circulate. Yet the whispers could not be locked up. Servants who had been in the house during the portrait claimed to have heard the sound of faint laughter echoing in the hallway, though no one else was there. A seamstress who had helped arrange the gown swore that as she brushed the veil across Ingrid's face, the bride's eyelids fluttered, just for a moment. Superstition spread like wildfire, and with it came a pattern of death. Within weeks, one of the bridesmaids fell ill and never recovered. A groomsman drowned mysteriously in calm waters. Even the photographer himself, who had first held the chilling image in his hands, was said to have taken his own life within a year. To the villagers, these were not coincidences. They were consequences. Historians today argue that such tales were the natural result of grief colliding with imagination. The mid-19th century was already rife with the practice of post-mortem photography, a way to memorialize the dead when life expectancy was short and loss was constant. Yet psychology tells us that collective trauma often reshapes memory, blurring truth with fear. Still, folklore clings to something darker. They insist that Ingrid's smile was no accident, no artifact of chemistry or science, but a curse etched into silver nitrate, a smile that bound all who witnessed it to the silence of the grave. And so, the mystery lingers. Was this merely a haunting accident of early photography, or a terrifying glimpse into a covenant between the living and the dead? Tonight we unearth the story of the bride who smiled in death. The year was 1855, and the western coast of Norway bore a silence that was not merely the silence of snow. It was the silence of hunger, of hard winters, of a people who leaned on faith and folklore with equal weight because neither alone could explain the relentless hardship that pressed against their lives. Outside the city of Bergen, along narrow fjords where mountains leaned close to the sea, there stood a small rural parish, a collection of wooden farmhouses. A church built from stone carried up the slopes, and a graveyard where the earth was always damp as if it remembered too much sorrow. This was the village where Ingrid Aas lived, and this was the soil that would nurture both her story and the legend that would follow her into death. The villagers were not strangers to tragedy. Famine had visited in the previous decades, leaving empty chairs at tables and rows of small graves carved into the hillside. Disease, especially consumption, known today as tuberculosis, was an unrelenting thief. In some families, it took fathers and sons together, in others mothers and daughters. Yet even in such a climate of loss, Ingrid's death was felt differently. She was not elderly, nor sickly, nor a child too fragile to withstand the northern cold. She was 21, a bride preparing to step into what should have been her brightest hour. That she died the very morning she was meant to be married was, to the villagers, more than misfortune. It was omen. The official record was simple, even cold. Ingrid Aas, female, age 21, cause of death: consumption. A disease so common in mid-19th century Europe that it barely warranted remark. But the villagers, who had watched Ingrid walk to church the week before with rosy cheeks, who had seen her preparing linens for her new household, did not accept that consumption had claimed her. They whispered of something else, something darker. They remembered that on the night before her death, a farmhand had glimpsed a shadow at her window, a shape too tall, too rigid to be mistaken for a tree or the trick of a lantern flame. Ingrid herself had lived a life that, by all accounts, was marked by grace and faith. The daughter of a fisherman, She had grown up learning both the discipline of labor and the solace of hymns sung at twilight. Villagers admired her not only for her beauty, pale skin, light hair, eyes that seemed almost silver in the dim Nordic light, but also for her character. She was, by many accounts, charitable to neighbors, quick to offer bread even when her own family lacked enough, and diligent in her attendance at Sunday service. Her voice, when lifted in hymns, was said to carry beyond the walls of the small church, as if it were not simply sound, but prayer turned into music. It was for these reasons that her sudden death seemed unnatural. How could someone so vital, so full of promise, simply slip away? The rational explanation, consumption, carried no weight for those who had heard no cough, seen no blood, noticed no wasting of her frame. They turned instead to old tales, stories whispered by grandmothers near the hearth, tales of the Huldra. The Huldra, in Norwegian folklore, was a forest spirit, a beautiful woman with long hair and a hollow back, who lured men into the woods with promises of love or riches. But the Huldra was also known to punish women who betrayed vows or failed in chastity. In Ingrid's case, the whispers took on a sharper edge. Some claimed she had been secretly promised to another before her engagement, that she had broken a vow, and that the Huldra had claimed her in retribution. Others suggested the shadow at her window was no human suitor, but the Huldra herself, waiting to collect what was owed. Psychology offers a different reading. In a community beset by famine, illness, and constant loss, there was little tolerance for randomness. To believe that Ingrid had simply died without cause would have been unbearable. Human minds, especially those trained by hardship, grasp for narrative, for meaning. And so her death became not an accident, but a story. One where innocence and sin, faith and superstition converged. But to her family, the matter was simpler. They wished to honor her as a bride, even in death. They dressed her in the white gown, arranged the veil over her hair, and prepared the chapel where she should have been wed. For them, this act was not superstition but devotion. If she could not walk the aisle in life, she would at least be remembered as if she had. It was this decision that would set the stage for the infamous photograph. But even before the shutter clicked, the unease had already taken root. Neighbors muttered that it was unnatural to pose the dead as if alive. They said the church would not bless such an image, that it was a defiance of God's natural order. Others, however, saw it differently, as an act of defiance not against God but against death itself. To hold her in bridal attire, preserved forever on glass, was to deny that death had truly stolen her. It was both mourning and resistance, grief and stubborn love. Still, the rumors grew. Some claimed Ingrid's engagement had been arranged not out of love, but out of obligation, that the union had been meant to heal a rift between families. If so, her death might have been seen as divine intervention, a judgment against a union without true devotion. Others whispered that her fiancé had been seen walking the fields late at night, speaking to no one, staring toward the forest as though waiting for someone unseen. And there were darker rumors still, that the Oss family had long carried a shadow, a history of women who died young, of daughters taken before their time. In this telling, Ingrid was simply the latest in a line marked by silence and sorrow. It is difficult in the modern age to separate fact from folklore. Historians scouring parish records find only the plain entry of her death, with no elaboration. Yet in oral histories and the stories handed down by villagers, Ingrid's passing was never just a medical event. It was the opening act of a haunting. To walk through that village today, one might see only moss-covered stones, abandoned farmhouses, and the gray-blue sea stretching endlessly toward the horizon. But in 1855, each of those stones carried meaning. Each shadow on the fjord carried suspicion. When Ingrid died, it was not just a bride lost. It was a breach between what was known and what was feared. And when her family prepared her body for the portrait that would make her infamous, they were not merely creating a memory. They were inviting the village into a mystery that would blur the line between grief and the supernatural. The village was, in many ways, the perfect setting for such a legend to take root. It was isolated, accessible only by boat or by paths through dense forest. Superstition thrived in such isolation. Tales of spirits, of curses, of bargains with forces unseen were not dismissed but accepted as part of daily life. The church offered comfort, yes, but even the most devout villagers still left offerings of bread at the edge of the woods, just in case. Faith and fear coexisted, neither fully displacing the other. When Ingrid died, both were invoked to explain her absence, faith to console, folklore to warn. What remains striking is the duality of her memory. To some, she was the epitome of innocence, a young woman whose faith and charity were cruelly cut short. To others, she was the bearer of a hidden sin, punished for vows broken or promises unfulfilled. And in that tension lies the seed of the legend, the contrast between purity and corruption, salvation and damnation, love and betrayal. It is the same contrast that would later infuse the photograph, where a bride's serene face bore a smile that no living person could explain, the shadow at her window, the sudden death without illness, the rumors of secret promises, the choice to dress her as a bride even in death. Each of these details, whether true or embellished, fed into the narrative that the village began to weave. And once the photograph was taken, once her image and that impossible smile were captured, the legend was sealed. But before we arrive at that moment, before the shutter clicks and history divides into before and after, we must linger in the village itself, in the tension between what was recorded and what was remembered. For it is in that tension that Ingrid's story lives on, a bride, beloved and mourned, whose life was a hymn but whose death was a riddle, one that would outlive every witness and echo still in whispers along the fjord. The photograph of Ingrid Aas was meant to preserve memory, not create legend. Yet within weeks of its development, the air in the village shifted, as if the act of freezing her smile on glass had stirred something that was better left to silence. The portrait was not displayed. Her family, uncomfortable with the unease it provoked, wrapped it in linen and stored it in a trunk. But the image could not be contained. Those who had seen it described the faint curl of her lips, that suggestion of mirth on a lifeless face, and their words spread faster than the frost on the fjord. It was not the gown, nor the veil, nor the pale serenity of her features that unsettled them. It was that impossible smile, fragile yet defiant, that clung to memory like smoke long after the picture itself was hidden away. The first death came swiftly. Johan Myklebust, the photographer summoned from Bergen to capture Ingrid in her bridal attire, was a man of routine and precision. In his city studio, he prided himself on the stillness he could coax from sitters, the clarity of images produced by his heavy, cumbersome camera. When he returned from the village, however, he seemed changed. Assistants noted that he grew pale and distracted, forgetting chemicals, leaving plates exposed, fumbling in ways uncharacteristic for a man known for his steady hands. Within a fortnight, Johan took to bed with fever. He rambled of a smile that will not let me rest, of eyes closed, yet watching. One assistant swore he heard him whisper Ingrid's name in the middle of the night. Though Johan had only met her once, lifeless and veiled, his illness deepened, and by the end of the month he was dead. The official cause was pneumonia. Yet those who had heard his muttering spoke differently, that the photograph itself had followed him home, not the physical glass plate, but something carried in his mind like a contagion. The second death was more public and more horrifying. Solveig, one of Ingrid's bridesmaids, had been walking across the frozen pond near her family's farm. She was young, strong, and known in the village as an accomplished swimmer who had often braved the fjord's icy waters. That winter day, the ice was considered thick and safe. Children had skated across it earlier. But as Solveig stepped toward the center, the surface gave way with a sudden crack. Villagers rushed to the sound, pulling her from the water, but she was already gone. Her skin was pale, her lips blue, and yet her expression bore something that froze the rescuers more than the cold water had. A faint, twisted smile, uncanny in its resemblance to Ingrid's. They buried her quickly, the family insisting she had been careless, but others whispered that she had been claimed, another offering in a string of tragedies that was only beginning. The third death struck at the heart of the legend. Anders, Ingrid's fiancé, had never recovered from her sudden passing. In the days after the funeral, he wandered the fields aimlessly, his once broad shoulders hunched, his voice scarcely above a whisper. He avoided the home he had been preparing, its half-built walls standing empty, tools abandoned. Villagers would find him seated in the church long after midnight, staring toward the altar, lips moving as though in conversation with someone unseen. Some said he prayed, others that he argued, his tone low and bitter as if bargaining with shadows. Then one morning he was found in a pew near the altar. His body was slumped, his hands clenched into fists, his face twisted in a grimace that mirrored the faint smile captured in Ingrid's photograph. Parish records note, death by exhaustion of the mind, possible self-harm, though no wound was found upon him. His heart, they said, had simply ceased. For villagers, no further proof was needed. Ingrid's smile, first frozen on glass, had begun to echo in flesh. The sequence of deaths spread fear like wildfire. Official explanations abounded. Illness, accident, despair. But no rational accounting could soothe the unease. The photograph became the focus of every whisper. It was said that Johan had stared too long at it, Solveig had been too near it, and Anders had dreamt of it nightly. The idea took root that Ingrid's smile was not an accident of rigor mortis nor a trick of chemistry, but a curse sealed in the moment of exposure. Anyone who lingered on it, anyone who let it live in their thoughts would soon carry it upon their own face in death. Priests attempted to calm the congregation. They spoke of God's will, of grief-clouding judgment, of the sin of superstition, yet even among them unease grew. One deacon, preparing Anders's body, confessed privately that he could not rid himself of the image of that grimace, so unnatural, so close to the photograph he had glimpsed only once. Another priest refused to enter the Oz household, claiming that the photograph was a blasphemy, a mockery of the sacred boundary between life and death. What is striking is how quickly folklore and faith collided in the village. On one hand, clerical voices insisted these were tragedies born of natural causes. On the other, oral rumor painted a tapestry of connections that no priest could unweave. Ingrid had smiled in death. Johann had dreamed of it until his fever consumed him. Solveig had drowned with the same curve upon her lips. Anders had carried it into his grave. Coincidence strained under the weight of repetition. Villagers began to avoid the Oz home entirely, fearful of even being near the trunk that held the image. Some accounts suggest that the family themselves began to fear what they had preserved. Ingrid's mother reportedly tried to burn the photograph, but when the trunk was opened, the glass plate was gone. Who had taken it? Theories abound. Some say Anders, before his own death, had stolen it to keep near him. Others suggest Johann's assistant had returned to the village and retrieved it, though no proof exists. The more superstitious claim the photograph had never been bound to wood or linen, but had already seeped into memory, into the very air of the village, impossible to destroy. Modern historians examining these deaths often point to grief psychology, a cluster of tragedies in a small community, each with plausible explanations, became bound together by narrative. The photographer's pneumonia, the bridesmaid's drowning, the fiancé's despair, all separate, all explainable. But human memory is not an archive of isolated facts. It craves pattern, seeks meaning, and clings to symmetry. The smile became the unifying thread, real or imagined. Once one villager remarked on the similarity, others could not help but see it too. What might have been coincidence transformed into curse, yet folklore resists the clean scalpel of psychology. To the villagers of 1855, the deaths were not random. They were ritual, as though Ingrid's bridal smile demanded companions, drawing others into her frozen expression. And when whispered at night, the story gained new embellishments. Some claimed Johann had actually photographed more than one plate, that a second image existed showing Ingrid's eyes half open, glinting with light. Others said Solveig had cried out Ingrid's name as she fell through the ice, though no one had truly heard her. With each telling, the web thickened, and the line between documented death and imagined curse blurred until they were indistinguishable. The sense of dread spread beyond those immediately touched. Farmers began refusing to work their fields near dusk, fearing they might glimpse a bridal figure among the birches. Mothers warned children not to speak Ingrid's name after dark. At least one family is said to have moved from the village entirely, citing ill fortune tied to the bride. And still the deaths, though fewer, seemed to hover. A child who sickened one winter, a sailor drowned at sea. Each loss was folded into the narrative, each blamed, in hushed tones, on the photograph. Even now, researchers debate whether the so-called curse was anything more than compounded tragedy. Skeptics argue that tuberculosis and pneumonia accounted for much, that drowning was tragically common in villages ringed by icy water, that despair after the loss of a betrothed was hardly unusual. Yet what makes the story endure is not the plausibility of natural causes, but the persistence of memory. The fact that every victim, in rumor if not in fact, bore Ingrid's smile at the end. To walk through the village graveyard today is to find markers weathered and nearly erased. Johann's stone is chipped, Solveig's barely legible, Anders lost beneath moss. But to the villagers who survived them, each stone was etched not merely with a name but with a warning. The photograph was never displayed again, never publicly acknowledged, but in silence, in whispers, it lived on, not as glass but as legend. Thus the first victims were remembered not as individuals, but as a chorus beneath Ingrid's frozen smile. Each death magnified the unease, until the photograph was no longer a relic of mourning, but an artifact of fear. Whether curse or coincidence, it had claimed its first offerings. And the village, once content to blame famine, disease, or fate, now carried a new terror. That death itself could smile, and that once seen, it could never be unseen. By the final decades of the 19th century, Ingrid Asse's story had grown too large to remain confined to a single Norwegian village. What began as hushed local whispers around a locked trunk had spread into taverns, city papers, and eventually the minds of scholars, priests, and skeptics across Scandinavia. The tale of the bride who smiled in death, captured forever by the unforgiving eye of a camera, was irresistible in an era perched uneasily between tradition and modernity. Europe was gripped by change. Science advanced at a pace once thought impossible, yet superstition clung to the shadows of every rural town. The case of Ingrid seemed to embody the battle between those two forces. Was her smile the simple work of nature, explained by muscle contraction and chemical chance? Or was it proof that even in an age of reason, death could mock the living with mysteries beyond their reach? The first to speak publicly against the legend were physicians. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was well known for leaving bodies thin, pale, and rigid. Doctors argued that Ingrid's sudden passing, recorded as due to that very illness, aligned with what they understood of the disease. Consumption wasted the body slowly, until the chest collapsed inward, the cheeks hollowed, and the muscles tightened. Upon death, the lack of oxygen could leave the lips drawn in a way that mimicked a smile. Coupled with rigor mortis, which caused muscles to stiffen, it was entirely possible for Ingrid's final expression to resemble mirth. To a grieving family, already searching for meaning, and to villagers already steeped in folklore, that smile had been transformed from a biological inevitability into a supernatural omen. But if medicine could explain Ingrid's expression, it could not so easily account for what followed. Skeptics dismissed the cluster of deaths in the village as a statistical inevitability. Disease, accidents, and despair were rampant in rural Norway. Yet when the stories reached Bergen and later Christiania, now Oslo, the details of the photograph drew particular attention. Photography itself was still young, and many urban elites considered it both miraculous and unsettling. If Ingrid's smile was unusual, might it have been a technical artifact rather than a spiritual one? Photographers of the era were quick to offer rational explanations. They knew that long exposure times often distorted images, particularly of the dead, who could not hold still. Chemical inconsistencies in collodion or silver nitrate could warp features in subtle ways, exaggerating the curve of a lip or hollow of a cheek. One noted that if a face was photographed under uneven light, shadows might deepen the appearance of a smile. To them, Ingrid's expression was not an omen, but an error of the process, magnified by grief. Yet if science was firm in its logic, the accounts that circulated resisted dismissal. For every medical lecture declaring the smile a natural contraction, there was a villager swearing they had seen the image change. The photograph, they said, did not remain static. Over time, the smile widened, the lips parted, and in some tellings, the eyes once closed appeared to glimmer faintly as though light had passed beneath the lids. Such claims made physicians scoff. Glass plates and prints did not change on their own. What people saw, they argued, was the malleability of memory, not of chemicals. But villagers insisted otherwise, and even outsiders who visited sometimes returned with their own uneasy stories. In the 1870s, as fascination with spiritualism spread across Europe, Ingrid's photograph became an object of pilgrimage for occult investigators. Mediums and seers traveled to the village begging to see it. Though the Ass family kept it hidden, at least one group succeeded in persuading them. What they reported only deepened the rift between science and superstition. They claimed that when the photograph was displayed in a quiet room, a faint sound, like distant laughter, echoed through the walls. Others swore that whispers could be heard if one stared too long. One visitor described the sensation of her heart quickening as though watched, even though Ingrid's eyes remained shut in the image. When these testimonies spread, skeptics dismissed them as theatrics, the sort of performance meant to stoke the spiritualist craze. But villagers who had long believed in Ingrid's curse nodded knowingly. The photograph, they said, carried her presence. The church, caught in the crossfire, took a predictable stance. Local priests declared the stories blasphemy, insisting they were inventions of the devil to weaken faith. To give weight to them, they argued, was to dishonor God and empower lies. Yet even within clerical circles, doubt lingered. Diaries from traveling missionaries in Norway mention the tale in passing, with language more cautious than condemnatory. They speak of a smile upon the bride, wrote one. I have not seen it, yet the people tremble still, and in their trembling is power. Even if they would not endorse superstition, priests could not deny its grip. It is here that psychology enters the narrative. By the late 19th century, early psychiatrists had begun exploring how trauma manifests in communities. Scholars suggested that the villagers, already weakened by famine, disease, and grief, had latched onto the photograph as a vessel for their sorrow. The human mind, they argued, struggles to accept randomness and suffering. To lose a bride, a fiancé, a friend beneath ice, a photographer to illness, all in swift succession, was unbearable if meaningless. By assigning those tragedies to a curse, they granted chaos the dignity of order. Science then explained not only the smile but the persistence of the story. It was not proof of the supernatural, but of human need for narrative. And yet, contradictions persisted. If Ingrid's expression was natural, why did so many deaths seem tied to her image? If the photograph was chemically flawed, why did visitors insist it changed before their eyes? Folklore thrives in precisely these gaps, where rational explanations stop short of satisfying emotional ones. What science could not soothe, superstition inflamed. In the decades that followed, Ingrid's case became an example in both camps. Physicians cited it as proof of how easily fear distorts perception. They published small articles in medical journals, dismissing the smile as rigor mortis, the deaths as coincidence, the whispers as hysteria. Spiritualists, on the other hand, pointed to the persistence of testimony across generations as proof that something lingered. The photograph itself disappeared from public view. Some say it was destroyed, others that it was hidden in church archives. But the story remained. Absence has always made it stronger. Perhaps the most telling feature of this clash was how it endured. Long after the village ceased speaking of Ingrid, outsiders still debated her. Students in Bergen's medical school were told the case as a cautionary tale about superstition. Meanwhile, folklore scholars recorded it as evidence of how grief and belief intertwined. Neither side could claim final victory. To the scientist, Ingrid's smile was merely a contraction. To the believer, it was a curse that science had failed to banish. This is where the story takes on its most haunting quality, not in proving one side right, but in showing how both persisted. Science gave answers but not comfort. Superstition gave fear but also order. Between them lingered the photograph itself, silent, unyielding, locked in a trunk, and in memory. Was it simply glass and shadow? Or had it captured something the chemicals could never explain? A last defiance, a bride refusing to go quietly into death, her smile an omen carved in silver and salt. The debate has never ended. Each new retelling revives the clash. Physicians dismissing, villagers remembering, spiritualists invoking, psychologists analyzing. More than a century later, we are left where they were then, at the uneasy intersection of rigor and rumor, of superstition and science. Perhaps Ingrid's smile was only rigor mortis. Perhaps it was only a photographic quirk. Or perhaps it was both, and something more, something unnamed, waiting in the shadows between explanation and belief. In stories like Ingrid Asse's, the dead rarely stay buried. Their names become whispers in families. Their images pass between generations like inherited relics, and their supposed curses ripple outward, reshaping lives that were never meant to be entangled. If science and superstition clashed fiercely in the 19th century, the survivors of the early 20th carried something more personal. Memory, haunted, fractured, but enduring. The tale of the bride who smiled in death did not die with the witnesses of 1855. It persisted in diaries, in the trembling confessions of children, in strange afflictions whispered about in hospital wards, and in the dreams of people who could not explain why they woke with the sense that someone had been standing at their bedside, smiling. The most enduring of these legacies was the so-called silence curse. In Bergen, decades after the infamous photograph had allegedly been hidden away, one family began to report an unsettling pattern. Several children across 3 generations were born without the ability to speak. Doctors at the time, still fumbling in their understanding of hereditary conditions, speculated about congenital defects. Yet the family themselves insisted the cause was something else. Their great-grandmother, they said, had been one of Ingrid's bridesmaids standing beside her in the church on the day the photograph was taken. It was whispered that Ingrid's faint smile had marked them, that those who stood closest to her bore its echo in their bloodline. While science pointed to genetics, the family clung to a darker interpretation. Silence as inheritance, silence as curse. The silence curse spread beyond this family's walls. Other villagers, unrelated by blood, described children who spoke fluently until the age of 7, only to fall mute without explanation. In some cases, their voices returned after months. In others, never. Teachers wrote notes in parish records about pupils who stared absently toward the chapel's ruins during lessons, lips moving as if in prayer, though no sound emerged. To the psychologists of the early 20th century, these accounts revealed the psychosomatic weight of fear. Communities convinced of a curse often produced children who embodied it, not through magic, but through the crushing expectations of belief. Folklorists, however, took a different stance. For them, such repetition across families and decades hinted not at shared psychology, but at the persistence of something unexplainable, a pattern too sharp to be dismissed as chance. Dreams, too, became a recurring thread in survivor testimonies. In the 1910s, a widow named Marta Borge wrote in her journal of recurring visions of Ingrid. Night after night, she dreamed of a woman in a wedding gown, standing just beyond the light of a lantern, smiling faintly, beckoning her closer. Marta, who had married into a family distantly connected to the Oz household, grew convinced that she had inherited the curse not by blood, but by proximity. She recorded in her diary, "The smile is never cruel, never kind, only fixed, as if she knows I will follow. I wake before I reach her, but the gown always brushes my hand, as though she has touched me." Marta's descendants preserved this diary, and later, folklorists cited it as one of the most compelling personal records of Ingrid's haunting. Nor was Marta alone. Dozens of oral testimonies gathered throughout the 20th century described similar dreams. Ingrid standing at the edge of fields, Ingrid appearing in mirrors, Ingrid smiling faintly behind veils. What united these accounts was not vivid violence but subtle dread. The smile, witnesses said, was never exaggerated or grotesque. It was faint, almost human, and precisely that made it horrifying. How could one be afraid of something so delicate, so ordinary, unless one knew it should not exist at all? One of the strangest testimonies emerged in 1932 from a young bride named Elin Christofferson. In her wedding album, preserved carefully in leather binding, she claimed that her veil appeared distorted in several photographs. Overlaying her own face, faint but visible, was what she swore resembled Ingrid's veil. When shown to others, the photograph seemed ordinary at first glance, but once the suggestion had been planted, many insisted they could see it too. A faint doubling, as if two brides occupied the same frame. For Elin, this was not coincidence. Her grandmother had lived in the village in 1855 and had once stood outside St. Brigid's Parish on the day Ingrid's portrait was taken. To Elin, the curse had followed her through blood and time, manifesting on the most sacred day of her life. Her husband dismissed it as hysteria, but Elin would not sleep in the same room as the album. She kept it locked away until her death. Psychologists studying cases like Elin's framed them as examples of projected trauma. They argued that collective memory could function almost as an infection, transmitting dread across generations until individuals manifested it in tangible ways. A woman taught that her family was cursed might subconsciously look for signs of intrusion, interpreting random shadows or photographic errors as evidence. In this reading, Ingrid's curse was not supernatural but cultural, a myth powerful enough to shape perception, to twist memory, and to imprint itself onto the very symbols of life and marriage. Folklorists disagreed. To them, the recurrence of imagery, the veil, the smile, the silence was too consistent to ignore. If imagination alone shaped these visions, why did strangers describe the same details? Why did multiple families, with no apparent connection, record similar afflictions? To dismiss it entirely as psychology was, in their view, to underestimate the persistence of the uncanny in human experience. Even into the mid-20th century, testimonies continued to surface. Soldiers returning from the Second World War told of dreams in which Ingrid appeared not in a gown, but in a shroud, standing at the edge of battlefields. Nurses in Bergen Hospital spoke of patients who, in feverish delirium, described being watched by a bride. In 1964, a psychiatric patient recorded drawings of a veiled woman whose face was always obscured by a faint, uncanny smile. The patient had no known connection to the Oss family, yet insisted the woman's name was Ingrid. Psychologists cited this as evidence of suggestibility, a cultural story embedding itself in the unconscious. Folklorists countered that it proved the legend had seeped deeper than rational explanation could reach. Some survivors took their testimonies further, offering not just dreams or afflictions but direct encounters. In the 1970s, a man named Henrik, descended from the original photographer's assistant, claimed that his attic was haunted by footsteps. When asked to describe them, he hesitated, then whispered, "It is not the sound of steps. It is the rustle of fabric, dragging, like a gown." His account was ridiculed at the time, dismissed as attention-seeking. Yet years later, when the attic was opened, His daughter found the remnants of an old trunk filled with glass negatives. Among them was a shattered plate that some insisted bore the faint outline of a smiling woman's face. What emerges from these testimonies is not a single coherent narrative, but a tapestry of fear, memory, and belief. Survivors described Ingrid not as a monstrous apparition, but as something subtler. A smile where there should be none, a veil where there should only be shadow, silence where there should be voice. Whether these accounts represent genuine hauntings or the psychological weight of folklore, they reveal the power of memory to shape lives across centuries. The clash between psychology and folklore sharpened with each passing decade. Psychologists emphasized intergenerational trauma, the way families pass stories down until they become lived realities. They argued that silence, dreams, and visions were symptoms of unresolved grief, refracted across time. Folklorists countered that repetition often signals hidden truths, that when multiple witnesses across eras describe the same image, the uncanny cannot be so easily dismissed. Today, descendants of those present at Ingrid's post-mortem portrait still speak of her. Some refuse to marry in churches, fearing veils and vows. Others avoid photographs altogether, claiming that cameras are traps for the soul. Whether cursed or conditioned, their lives remain marked by the smile of a bride buried more than a century ago. The dead, after all, do not need to rise to haunt us. They need only to linger in memory, their faces reshaped in dreams, their stories repeated until they feel like our own. And so the survivors' accounts do not resolve the legend of Ingrid Aas. They deepen it. In the silence of mute children, in the trembling of brides staring at their veils, in the laughter heard behind locked doors, the story lives on. Was this intergenerational trauma, a psychological scar passed down like an heirloom? Or was it proof of a covenant unbroken, a smile that refused to fade? The answer, as always, remains hidden, just beyond reach, smiling faintly from the shadows of history. 2 centuries have passed since Ingrid Aas, the bride who smiled in death, was laid to rest in the frozen soil of a Norwegian village. Yet her name endures, her story lingering like a shadow across the thresholds of history, science, folklore, and myth. For some, the tale is no more than a distorted memory, a local ghost story magnified by superstition. For others, it is evidence of forces beyond human comprehension, a crack in the veil between the living and the dead. Across the decades, explanations have multiplied, each theory shaping Ingrid into something different. A tragic woman whose death was natural, a myth conjured from grief, or a soul imprisoned by ritual in a photograph that should never have been taken. None of the theories resolve the mystery completely. Instead, they fracture it further, reminding us that legends are rarely linear. They are mosaics built from fear, speculation, and desire. The first and perhaps most mundane explanation is offered by historians and skeptics. To them, Ingrid's so-called smile was nothing supernatural. They point to the known realities of post-mortem photography in the 19th century. It was not uncommon for families, especially in rural communities, to preserve the likeness of the deceased in photographs. These images often attempted to restore dignity, propping the dead in lifelike poses, dressing them in finery, even arranging their limbs to mimic natural repose. Under such conditions, small shifts in rigor mortis could create the illusion of expression, a tightening of muscles, the contraction of facial tissue, the subtle distortion of glass negatives, all could account for what villagers described as a faint smile. Historians further argue that Ingrid's death, recorded as consumption, was tragically common in the 1850s. Tuberculosis ravaged Norway as it did much of Europe, claiming young lives without discrimination. To imagine something sinister in her passing, they say, is to romanticize tragedy. As for the subsequent deaths of the photographer, the bridesmaid, and Ingrid's fiancé, historians note that rural life was fraught with danger. Illness, drowning, and even suicide were far from rare. Linking them to a single photograph, in this view, was a desperate attempt by a grieving community to assign meaning to random misfortunes. To skeptics, Ingrid was no cursed bride, only the unfortunate subject of a story spun larger with every retelling. Yet this explanation falters when confronted with the persistence of details. Skeptics may dismiss Ingrid's smile as rigor mortis, but what of the reports that the photograph changed over time? Accounts from the late 19th and early 20th centuries describe the smile growing wider, the eyes appearing to regain a glimmer of life. Some researchers claim the image itself shifted, as though Ingrid were not fixed in glass but waiting within it. Historians attribute this to deterioration, chemical reactions altering the emulsion, light exposure warping the surface. But believers ask, Why would these distortions produce a face more lifelike rather than less? Why would the photograph appear to animate unless something lingered within it? This leads to the second theory, that the photograph itself was cursed. Folklore across cultures warns of mirrors and images capturing fragments of the soul. In Norway, old tales spoke of the fjellspøkelser, mountain ghosts that could be trapped in reflections. For villagers steeped in such beliefs, it was not unthinkable that Ingrid's image might contain more than memory. Paranormal theorists argue that the act of photographing her, especially so close to death, was an invitation. Cameras were new, their mechanisms mysterious, and to many they were portals, devices capable of freezing not only light, but life itself. Ingrid's faint smile then was not the play of rigor mortis but the trace of her soul, caught between body and plate. If this theory holds, it offers one explanation for the chain of misfortunes. Anyone who gazed too long upon the photograph risked connection to Ingrid, their own vitality siphoned by her imprisoned spirit. The photographer, bridesmaid, and fiancé may have been the first victims of this tethering. Later accounts, muted children, recurring dreams, veils appearing in wedding photographs, become echoes of that bond, reverberations of a spirit bound to glass. Folklorists who support this view argue that the photograph was eventually destroyed, not out of superstition but necessity, to sever the link and end the curse. Records suggest the plate may have been shattered in the 1920s, though no definitive proof exists. Its absence only deepens the mystery. A third theory pushes further still into the occult. Some claim Ingrid was not merely trapped by accident, but chosen deliberately. According to this view, her death on the eve of marriage was no coincidence. Occultists argue that certain priests in Wexford, or local mystics traveling through Norway, sought to bind her soul at the moment of passage. Her beauty, her innocence, her liminal state between bride and corpse, all made her the perfect vessel for ritual. The photograph in this reading was not a family's act of mourning but the final seal in a covenant. By capturing her smile, the priests or occultists created a conduit, a bridge between the living and the dead. Some even suggest that they pursued immortality, channeling Ingrid's spirit to anchor themselves against decay. Such claims are, of course, unprovable, yet fragments of testimony lend them weight. Diaries of visiting scholars in the 1870s mention hearing villagers speak of priests who lingered at the grave, of chants in Latin carried on the wind near Ingrid's resting place. While historians dismiss these as exaggerations or misunderstandings, occult theorists weave them into a larger narrative. Ingrid was not simply a victim of chance but of design. Her soul bound as an offering in a ritual that still lingers in whispers. Beyond these major theories lies a spectrum of interpretations. Some folklorists frame Ingrid as a symbol rather than a spirit. They argue that her story reflects cultural anxiety about death, marriage, and the boundaries of womanhood in the 19th century. The bride who smiled in death embodies the fear of unfulfilled vows, of lives cut short before roles could be completed. In this sense, her haunting is not literal but archetypal. She lingers in memory because she represents a rupture in the natural order. Others see her as a cautionary tale, used to police morality in small communities, to warn young women of breaking vows, to frighten men into faithfulness, to remind families of the cost of pride. Ingrid's story served as a cultural tool as much as a ghost tale. At the farthest edge of speculation are those who argue that Ingrid never existed at all. According to this view, the bride who smiled in death was entirely invention, a folktale born from overlapping rumors of post-mortem photography, superstition, and grief. Supporters of this theory point to the absence of surviving records. Church documents, they note, are conspicuously silent. No official portrait has ever been recovered. Perhaps, they argue, the entire story was fabricated, a legend stitched together to explain tragedies that had no single cause. Like so many ghost stories, it would then be less about one woman and more about the community itself, expressing its fears through a shared myth. But this explanation, too, fails to satisfy. Too many families recall the curse as personal. Too many diaries, testimonies, and dreams describe the same figure, the same smile, the same veil. Even if Ingrid's name were invention, the haunting itself feels real to those who live it. And in folklore, the boundary between fact and fiction matters less than the persistence of belief. Whether or not Ingrid ever walked in flesh, her smile remains alive in memory, shaping behaviors and feeding dread. In the end, none of the theories fully align. The historian's dismissal cannot explain the photograph's alleged changes. The skeptic's insistence on coincidence does not account for the recurrence of dreams across generations. The folklorist archetype cannot dismiss the physical testimonies of distorted veils and shattered negatives. And the occultist's ritual, seductive as it may be, remains beyond evidence. Each explanation illuminates one piece of the puzzle, but leaves the others in darkness. Perhaps that is why Ingrid's story endures. It is not a tale designed to resolve, but to linger, to haunt. To some, she is a woman lost too soon, remembered through the distortions of grief. To others, she is a spirit trapped within glass, smiling faintly as she waits. And to those who fear more than they believe, she is something else entirely. A reminder that death does not always close the door. Sometimes it leaves it ajar, just wide enough for a smile to slip through. And so, the theories and myths of Ingrid Oss remain as fractured as the legend itself. Science, folklore, skepticism, and the occult all converge, but none conquer. The truth, if it exists, is buried in ruins, hidden in vanished photographs, whispered in dreams that repeat across centuries. We are left only with a choice: to dismiss her as coincidence, to revere her as myth, or to fear her as real. Whatever path we choose, the bride who smiled in death remains, her faint curve of lips fixed forever between explanation and mystery. Today, the tale of Ingrid Oss endures not in archives but in whispers. The ruins of St. Olav's Chapel, where her fiancé was found lifeless, still stand in silence, their crumbling stones veined with moss, their hollow windows letting in the cold breath of the Norwegian wind. Travelers who wander too close claim the air shifts near the altar, growing inexplicably colder, as though something unseen lingers there still. Local villagers avoid the site after dusk, leaving it to owls and fog, but stories persist of faint laughter or the rustle of fabric in the dark. Even now, the place bears the weight of her name, a reminder that history is not only written in books, but etched into landscapes that never forget. No confirmed photograph of Ingrid has ever surfaced, yet rumors continue to circulate of a single surviving glass plate. Some whisper it is hidden in private hands, passed carefully from one generation to the next, never displayed but always feared. Others insist the photograph was destroyed in the 1920s by a priest who burned it in secret, terrified of the power it seemed to hold. And yet, curious accounts occasionally resurface. A researcher who claimed to have glimpsed a faded negative in Bergen, a collector who spoke of a face that seemed too lifelike for death, a traveler who swore he saw the veil of a bride overlaying his own reflection. Whether these are lies, hallucinations, or traces of truth, no one can say with certainty. The absence of evidence only deepens the allure of the myth, leaving more questions than answers. Psychologists, attempting to ground the story in reason, argue that Ingrid's legend is nothing more than projection, a collective trauma crystallized into folklore. To them, the smile was not supernatural but symbolic, a way for the living to assign meaning to loss. Priests take a harsher view, condemning the story as blasphemy, a distortion crafted to undermine faith and taint the sacred institution of marriage. Folklorists, however, argue the opposite, that the very lack of physical proof is what gives the tale its power. Legends do not need photographs or documents to survive. They persist because they feed something deeper, the human need to believe that sorrow has meaning, that tragedy leaves a mark beyond silence, and so the mystery remains unresolved. Was Ingrid merely a victim of disease, her final expression a trick of science, her story a product of grief exaggerated over time? Or did her faint smile conceal something more enduring, something that outlived her body and bound itself to the world of the living? The answer is no closer now than it was in 1855. Perhaps the truth was buried with her, beneath the frozen earth of that small Norwegian village. Or perhaps even now it lingers in the shadows, waiting for anyone brave enough to look too long, to lean too close, to risk seeing a smile where none should ever be.